Aloha. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'm Denise Conan, Dean of the College of Social Sciences at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and President of the Northeast Asia Economic Forum. I'm joining you live from the beautiful College of Social Sciences digital studios. Today's live stream is jointly sponsored by the College, Northeast Asia Economic Forum, and Track to Asia. Today's presentation is part of a college's series, CSS Spotlight World. This is a webinar series that explores issues of international relations, diplomacy, and Hawaii's emerging role in a global society. Before we begin, I'm especially excited to let you know that we have a small in-person audience in the studio with us today, students and faculty from the College of Social Sciences. Welcome. It is now my pleasure to introduce our special guest today, Mr. Glyn Ford. Mr. Ford is the director of Track to Asia and a former long-standing member of the European Parliament. Glyn has traveled to North Korea nearly 50 times to promote international relations and peace between the EU and North Korea. And Glyn has a unique perspectives into the interworkings of the Kim regime and Pyongyang. His books include North Korea on the Brink and Talking to Korea. Today, he will be sharing his insights with us, and we are just delighted to have you with us today, Glyn. It's been a while since I've seen you, but I've seen you online at early hours of the morning as we were talking about. We are so glad we can be in person with you today, so welcome.
I'm delighted to be back in Hawaii for the first time in about 3 years. Zoom meetings really don't give you the sun or the sand.
It's such a pleasure to have you in person with us.
But yes.
Thank you.
I'm delighted to be here for several reasons apart from the location. I think it's interesting for audiences in the United States sometimes to get a slightly different perspective on North Korea. Being a European, and we're not in negotiation with the North Koreans in the same way. I think it gives you a different set of insights, because whenever Americans meet North Koreans, in a sense, it's a form of combat.
Yeah.
Whereas we have a kind of different relationship. And secondly, by accident rather than design, it's no merit on my behalf. In terms of relations with North Korea, I've fundamentally been in a situation where we've been talking to the party. In North Korea, like in all communist countries, the people who really make the decisions are not the ministries, but the parties. And we've been in dialogue. I've been in dialogue with the international department of the party. Two of the last recent foreign ministers over the last decades have ending up being promoted to the head of international department of the party. That's a promotion, not a demotion. So Kang Suk-ju, who was the chief negotiator in the six-party talks, spent a period of time before he died of colon cancer as head of the international department of the party. And I was involved in a series of conversations with him. And we brought him over to Korea. I know that his favorite book is Gone with the Wind. So a fact not many people will probably know about North Koreans in terms of their favorite American books. And secondly, we had Ri So-young, who moved from foreign minister to head of the party. And he was one of the four men in the room at the summit meetings with President Xi, with President Moon Jae-in, and with Donald Trump. So those are the people we've been dealing with, which gives you a slightly different insight. I've been engaged in a reasonably serious way with North Korea since 1997. At that point, the North Korean embassy to UNESCO, they didn't have an embassy to Paris, they still don't, or any other embassies near Brussels, actually came to see me to say that they had a food problem. They had a famine and they needed emergency food aid. And they actually raised with me whether at the time we had bovine CJD, and we were destroying millions of cattle. And they said, could they actually have the beef that we were destroying because people in North Korea were actually starving? I said I needed to see what the situation was, needed to see the situation on the ground, because if I was going to make this case. And so I went with two colleagues in an unofficial delegation to Pyongyang, and we saw how grim the situation was. In 1997, the lights were going out. Every so often, the electricity was failing. We visited children's centers and hospitals where there were no facilities. And although I'm not a doctor, I could see that the children were malnourished, if not worse. So I came back to Europe. I did say to the North Koreans, would they like an official delegation from the European Parliament? And they said yes. And I said, well, you don't care how I get it? No. So I tabled a very critical resolution demanding access by the European Parliament to North Korea. And surprise, surprise, when we wrote to the North Koreans demanding access, the response was, of course, send a delegation. And so I was on a second delegation, then a third and a fourth ad hoc delegation from the European Parliament, before we ended up in 2004 actually establishing a standing delegation. People talk about relations with North Korea. The European Parliament has standing interparliamentary delegation with the Korean Peninsula, with North and South Korea. And that's still ongoing. In fact, I'm no longer a member of the European Parliament. I lost my seat in 2009, but last week I actually addressed the Korean Peninsula delegation in Brussels about what the current state of play is. I've been to North Korea in a variety of guises. I've been probably 8 or 10 times on behalf of the European Parliament. I've been on behalf of the Socialist Group in the European Parliament, and I've taken delegations of Labour Party members. Let me say the Labour Party has not sent a delegation to North Korea, but individual Labour Party members have gone on delegations. I've also been there on behalf of the Friedrich Neumann Foundation, which is one of the German foundations. It's actually a foundation of the CSU in Germany, when we talked about economic modernization. Back in 2010, I was asked if I would set up a political dialogue with North Korea. And they wanted a group of European politicians to engage in political dialogue. And I have to say, it seemed to me that was not possible. No European politician are going to want to have a political dialogue. But I did suggest instead that maybe we should get some former political figures to actually engage in a dialogue. One of the ones I approached was Jonathan Powell, Tony Blair's former chef de cabinet, who now runs an NGO called Intermediate on peacemaking and peace building. And he and I have organized this dialogue now for a decade. We haven't been there since 2018 because of COVID, but we've had probably 15 meetings, one in Europe. So it's been very difficult to bring the North Koreans to Europe, and the rest in Pyongyang. And as I said, our interlocutor has been head of the international department of the party through all that process. There's been a problem in the sense post-Hanoi. Our normal interlocutors have disappeared. I'm not suggesting they've been purged and been shot or eaten by starving dogs or anything, but the pro-engagement tendency in North Korea actually suffered from the result of that process. It was obviously an extremely painful event for the North Koreans. 3.5 days on the train, and then be told that there was no progress. That train journey back to Pyongyang must have been unpleasant in its entirety. And the key figures, both in the international department and in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, all disappeared. The only one that's back in any way at the moment is Chae Song-wi, who is fairly well known, but she disappeared effectively for probably more than a year, and has come back with a more antagonistic tone, and certainly less pro-engagement than was the case previously. I haven't been to Pyongyang since 2018. Late 2018 was the last time. I have been in contact on a fairly regular basis as someone who lives fundamentally in Brussels and the UK. We've had meetings with the Berlin ambassador, the North Korean ambassador to Germany. In fact, post-Brexit, is now responsible for North Korea's relations with the European Union. I see the ambassador in London, who was up until Brexit responsible for those relations, and is in charge of managing the delegation the political dialogue that I mentioned. We asked who was going to carry on with that role, and he's been given that job. And I was also more recently had dinner with the North Korean ambassador in Stockholm. I was in Stockholm for a conference on North Korea, and we met. So someone said to me, "When did you last meet a North Korean?" Well, it was on Sunday. I had dinner with the ambassador in London on Sunday. But where are we with North Korea? What have I learned from talking to North Korea? And let me say, I'm trying to explain this from their perspective. Some people possibly will not like what I'm saying. They'll disagree with it. Feel free, absolutely. But I think it is important to see the situation, at least from time to time, from a North Korean perspective than merely from a perspective of the West and the rest, as we might put it. They see two systemic threats to the future of North Korea. One of which is internal. There's an internal threat if you don't keep people happy. And the people who have to be kept happy are the people in Pyongyang, because fundamentally that's the capital. That's where everything goes. That's where everybody wants to live. Actually, there are two internal borders in North Korea. There's a special economic zone in the far northeast, up on the China-Russia border, called Rason. And to enter that zone, you have to go through customs controls, and you have to produce papers and passports. The second zone is Pyongyang. Around Pyongyang is a ring, and to go in and out of, go out of Pyongyang is easy. Come back in, you need to have permission, and you need to have the right documents. So, yeah, it's the people of Pyongyang that actually matter. Secondly, there's an external threat. There's a threat from outside, and that external threat is the United States, the Republic of Korea, and Japan. They see that as a very serious threat. Kim Jong Un in 2012, I think it was, talked about the Bunjin line. He was going to advance the economy and the military together at the same time, and that reflects the problems facing him, the two systemic threats. The problem is that there's a paradox there. Because the paradox is, if you're successful in developing, if you want your military, your weapons of mass destruction, then you undermine the ability to deliver on the economy. Because the consequence of that has been, rack upon rack of new sets of sanctions. We even got to the stage recently where they sanctioned the North Korean cartoon industry. And someone I know said he would sleep better at night knowing that there are no more North Korean cartoonists actually on American television. The external threat. North Korea has lost the arms race. They've been outlapped. The reason for their move towards weapons of mass destruction, particularly their nuclear deterrent, is exactly that. The Republic of Korea's military budget is bigger than the North Korean GDP. So if North Korea spent all of its money, it spends probably 25% of its GDP on the military, then if it spent all of its money, it wouldn't have the same military budget as South Korea. If you put together South Korea, Japan, and the United States, North Korea is outspent by a factor of 60. Every time there's been a clash along the northern limit line, and yes, South Koreans say, which is the maritime border between North and South on the East Coast, sorry, on the West Coast. South Korean sailors have died, but more North Koreans have died. They lose those fights. They know where they are. So for them, for North Korea, the only solution has been, if you want, weapons of mass destruction, particularly nuclear and ICBMs. The attractiveness of weapons of mass destruction for the North Koreans is it actually does several things at the same time. It's an answer to the question about how do we continue to deter the external threat when we have lost the conventional arms race. It also helps in two other areas. North Korea has two enormous shortages. It has a shortage of manpower, and I use manpower deliberately rather than person power, because North Korea is not a developing economy. North Korea is an industrial state. It's a failed industrial state, but nevertheless, there is no enormous pool of peasant labor out there ready to be inducted into the factories and the future. So if you want more people working in manufacturing, then you have to get them from somewhere. And the obvious place is from the million-man North Korean army. You could easily decant 100,000 people out of that system if there are alternative ways of deterring the South, the United States, and Japan from taking action. The second shortage area is energy. North Korea's got an enormous energy shortage. Things are a bit better than they were back in 1997, but outside of Pyongyang, you're lucky to get electricity for maybe 4 or 6 hours a day. In Pyongyang, most of the time it's there, it's available, but nevertheless, it makes it a problem. North Korea is heavily dependent on hydroelectricity, but on the basis of various surveys, they've almost reached the limits, and they're having a problem with climate change because now you're getting bigger and worse storms, the result of which sediments being washed into the reservoirs and the hydroelectricity is less effective. They have a big coal industry, but again, that can be problematic. In the past, they've had floods, and some of those mining areas are still not entirely recovered. They see the future as nuclear. I mean, some people will react to nuclear in North Korea. No, that's not possible. Well, actually, with the agreed framework back in 1994, which was a deal between the United States and North Korea, when they agreed to stop moving towards nuclear weapons, the US offered to build to be responsible for ensuring the building of 2 light water reactors in North Korea. So certainly back in 1994, Washington did not think that civil nuclear power was a no-no in North Korea, which is one of the reasons why, if you want, the Singapore Declaration was so important for North Korea. The Singapore Declaration, you'll remember, which is after the first Trump-Kim meeting, actually said that one of the aims was denuclearization of the peninsula. Now, that's a very important issue, denuclearizing the peninsula, because from a North Korean perspective, the way you read that is clearly the South Koreans are not going to give up its civil nuclear program, so we can have a civil nuclear program as well. So, which is why, and I probably come back to it, is why some of the early statements by the Biden administration missed that point. They may not have wanted to use the same language as President Trump and his administration, but when they started referring to denuclearization of North Korea, that was very definitely picked up in a big way in Pyongyang and a very negative way. In terms of the economy, in terms of keeping the people who matter happy, it's about economic reform or economic modernization. The problem is that the image Donald Trump had of a changing North Korea was a North Korean of US-style capitalism. With there was that famous video he showed to Kim Jong Un of sort of condos on the beach and McDonald's or Kentucky Fried Chicken on every corner. no, this is economic reform Asian style. This is more Japan's Zaibatsu, Japan's corporations, Korea's chaebols, China's state-owned enterprises. It's that kind of capitalism. It's that kind of economic reform. I sometimes refer to it as kind of market Leninism. Air Koryo, North Korea's state airline, last time I was in North Korea was running taxis. It's got some kind of logic if you're an airline to get further into transport, but they're also producing food and drink. They're spreading out. You're getting horizontal and vertical change. You're also getting there's an encouragement of entrepreneurship in a way, but often under the shelter of the state institutions. There's a lot of economic activity around the ministries, around the military units, around the international department of the party, and the party more generally. It's a kind of public-private partnership. You use your skills and expertise and your knowledge to go out and open a restaurant in Pyongyang. Many of the Italian restaurants are run by the European section of the International Department of the Party, or something like that, and you share the benefits with your party unit. So it's good for both sides. But at the same time, you also have the kiosk capitalists following the arduous march, the famine. You saw the opening of some semi-official, even some official markets where you had people out there, farmers markets. So it seems to me that not many farmers are growing sort of electronic equipment, but fine, farmers markets. And some of those people borrowed money. Some of them went bankrupt or in a bad way. Many are surviving. 1 in 100 actually made a success of it. I mean, a real success and made real money. And they're the Dongju, the new rich in Pyongyang. And there's been some comments recently about the fact that Kim Jong Un is actually clamping down on the economic reform process. My analysis of that is that's exaggerated. What he's clamping down on are, if you want, these independent entrepreneurs, not the ones within the state institutions. It's what I would call the ronin, the masterless samurai. The ones working with their master are fine. The ones out on their own are the problem, because they're the ones that are starting to engage. I'm talking about the very small number, are very successful in conspicuous consumption, work conforming to North Korean social norms and the rest. And it seems to me that it's a misjudgment of what's happening in North Korea to take the view that what's being done to the people, to this group, is necessarily a signal that there is no support for economic reform. If only because there's not very many alternatives. The North Korean vision is a very old-fashioned vision. They think that they can have they can develop a tiger economy like Hong Kong, Singapore, Taiwan, or whatever. And their tiger economy is going to be modeled on people in their thousands working in factories. Now, that's not really a model we see as the future very much in the United States and Europe. But it seems to me one has to be careful because it might just work in North Korea. And the reason it might just work in North Korea is that North Korea is probably the world's last reservoir, not of cheap labor. There's cheap labor in all over Africa, Asia, and South America. But this is cheap skilled labor, or at least semi-skilled labor, which makes a difference because the skill levels in North Korea, no one's suggesting many African countries are creating intercontinental ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons in their backyard. So there's a skill level there that's not necessarily true everywhere. All this for the moment is on hold because of COVID. For the North Koreans, I will stick my neck out, it's been a public health triumph. They've managed to avoid COVID effectively in North Korea. They closed down before China closed down, and they closed down in such a draconian way, as we've seen, that quarantine and the rest. That the only thing is, it's been an economic disaster because the economy's stopped, and because there are no external inputs coming in at all. And they may be a Juche philosophy, self-reliance, but there's a limit to self-reliance, and so we have to deal with that particular issue. I mean, North Korea had the experience with Ebola. No case of Ebola probably got within 5,000 miles of North Korea. But with Ebola, they did the same thing. They actually closed down very early. They maintained closed and then opened up. The problem is that they learned the wrong lesson from that. And they weren't alone, because the countries that have gone for a zero COVID policy on the assumption that if we clamp down, eventually it will be wiped out, have been proved wrong. China, Australia, Taiwan, New Zealand, and North Korea are all facing the prospects. You can't remain closed forever. How do you actually open up? North Koreans have talked about having producing their own vaccine, or actually having a vaccine production plant given to them by the international community. From a scientific point of view, I'm told that mRNA is not a scientific problem. It doesn't give them the ability to make advanced chemical weapons. But from a political point of view, it seems to me rather unlikely that anything's going to happen. There's some hints that Omicron might be good news. I mean, in the sense it's that much less severe. It's possible to get to a herd immunity, and I don't know the numbers, but certainly with less pain. Of course, there's always the prospect now that the world's beginning to develop tablets to deal with it. People ask me about unification. The North Koreans are not interested in early unification. The people at the top in North Korea are well aware that their economy is 50 times smaller than South Korea. Early unification can only be assimilation. So what they say is, what we want is for the South Koreans, and mainly the United States, to end their hostile policy so they can go out and develop their economy with these big factories and the rest. Come back in 25 years when we're at least in the same league as you, the South, before we can talk unification, because of course there's very little attraction to assimilation. I've left it a while before we get to the kind of the elephant in the room. The nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrent program. The North Koreans have successfully tested a number of nuclear weapons underground. Some of their early tests were fizzles. They didn't properly work, but they learned from that process, and they got to a point where they have successfully tested a number of nuclear weapons, including what is generally considered to be a hydrogen bomb. On their missiles, they have very effective short range and medium range missiles, and they've tested 2 intercontinental ballistic missiles, which demonstrated a range to get to the mainland United States. No one's set off any March the 20th warnings yet in mainland USA, but it seems to me that North Korea has the capacity to crash land a missile somewhere in the mainland USA. What does that actually mean? Well, the North Koreans have certainly developed an ICBM that could crash. It's not clear they actually have the payload capacity. I mean, nuclear weapons, even miniaturized ones, have a payload. But let's assume they've got payload and they've got the ICBM. They have not yet developed solid fuel for stages, because with liquid fuel, you've got about 7 or 8 hours notice before they take off. So you can't assume that Washington will do nothing. With solid fuel, it's down to minutes. That makes it a very different proposition. But the three main problems are marrying together a weapon and a platform, which is they've not yet done. Secondly, is re-entry. There's very little evidence that the North Koreans have occasionally made reference to it, because they've been reading the same material I've been reading about the fact they have no re-entry capability. Because building re-entry technology to actually bring a weapon back through the atmosphere when temperatures rise to thousands of degrees is far from easy. And lastly is guidance. There's no evidence that any guidance. Someone in the State Department some time ago told me they thought they'd be lucky to hit within 200 kilometers of the target, which means that if they're aiming at Pearl Harbor, watch out sort of the Big Island. So they've got that problem. And they've also got the knowledge that they'll get immediately wiped out afterwards. People have got very excited about some of the recent tests. I mean, North Korea back in 2017, after the successful ICBM launch, they had the nuclear test, I think, back in September. Then they had 2 ICBM launches in November. And after the second of those ICBM launches, Kim Jong Un announced that we now have our nuclear deterrent, and he was going to impose a self-imposed moratorium. He got nothing for it. I mean, no deal from the United States or anything else. We are not going to test again for the future. Now, we then went through Singapore, Hanoi, and the mini summit in Panmunjom and the rest. And he maintained that moratorium until comparatively recently, when he announced that the moratorium was over. Now, they've not tested a nuclear weapon since. And they've not tested an ICBM since. They've tested intermediate range missiles, but not an ICBM. The testing is driven by a number of factors. I mean, like the US, like the European Union, the North Koreans are continuing to develop their military capacity. There's only so much that can be done in the labs and so much that can be done on components. So I think a lot of the testing is technology driven. You need to test the new technologies. You can't assume they're going to work again when you put them together, even if they work individually. And it's the same as the US argument. The US argues, rightly so too, that joint military exercises are necessary to ensure that we continue to have operational capacity. The North Koreans would argue that our early year missile tests in numbers are also there to demonstrate we still have the operational capacity there actually on the ground. They do sometimes pick provocative dates. I mean, they may need to test their missiles, but they can wait a few days till it's an appropriate date. And actually, I was rather expecting something yesterday, because it was the 80th anniversary of the birth of Kim Jong-il.
Okay.
So I disappointed might be the wrong word. I was slightly surprised that there wasn't something. I thought there might be a satellite launch, because hanging out there are Kim Jong-un's speech at the 8th Party Congress and the more recent speech at the 4th plenum of the party, when he said he forecast the missile testing. I mean, he said we're going to be testing missiles, and he also said we're going to launch a satellite. Because the other thing that the North Koreans are very enthusiastic about is being able to maintain a civil satellite program. They say the South Koreans have got a satellite program, Japanese have got a satellite program. Why can't we have a satellite program? So those are two difficult issues. I have to say that I think that satellite program is probably more problematic than a nuclear program. So, what do the North Koreans want to give up their nuclear program? Well, there's two elements to it. One of which is security guarantees. They need security guarantees, and it was put to us very clearly on one of the meetings. Security guarantees are no longer a piece of paper signed by the current American president. That's what they got back in 1994, essentially. You've got Bill Clinton saying it's all fine. It turned out it wasn't all fine when George Bush ripped it up. And more recently, the North Koreans have seen, not to them, I mean, President Trump engaged with North Korea, but he didn't engage very well with Iran. And so they want something that's more than that. And it's been interesting that the North Koreans have been following the joint, the JPCOA, the JCPO, Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which was the Iran deal, and what's been going on around it very carefully, because they see something a bit like the Iran deal as providing the security guarantees that they're looking for. And what impressed them was Trump's attempt to abrogate the deal, because unlike when George Bush abrogated the agreed framework, that was it. He said one day, it's over. The JPCOA, JCPOA, what happened was, hang on. The Russians and the Chinese said that the Iranians are fulfilling their part of the deal. More importantly, the European Union, the United Kingdom, France, and Germany, all of whom were signatories to that, said they're fulfilling the deal. So the deal was fundamentally the Security Council Plus had a robustness and resilience that was not true of the agreed framework. So that made a big difference. And secondly, they're looking for a measure of compensation. I mean, the agreed framework was to give the North Koreans $4.5 billion worth of light water reactors. 25 years on, and the fact that they're now not giving up their development program, but giving up both a nuclear and an ICBM program, you're probably looking for a payment of at least 15 to 20 billion. Now, the problem is that there's no way that any American president is going to be willing or able to actually pay that. I mean, if Joe Biden suddenly decided he was prepared to pay that, Congress, even with the Democrats in control, wouldn't pass it. So that means that while the early negotiations on any deal will be clearly between Washington and Pyongyang, and between Seoul and Pyongyang, at the later stages, it's got to go wider, because if you're going to have the Security Council Plus, and the plus this time won't be Germany, it's more likely to be South Korea and Japan. It's going to be a similar kind of structure, and they're going to want to be involved in it. And interestingly, the Chinese are now beginning to talk for the first time in probably about 5 or 6 years of six-party talks, which is basically China, Russia, South Korea, North Korea, Japan, and the United States. And the reason for that is the changes in politics in Japan. Abe was seen by the North Koreans to have wrecked the six-party talks over the issue of the abductees. I'm not supporting the North Koreans over the abductee issue at all. What went on was absolutely terrible. But nevertheless, that was how the North Koreans saw it. So for them, it wasn't possible to do a deal with Japan kind of in the room. Suga, who succeeded Abe, was of the same faction and was Abe's chosen successor. Now you've got with Kishida, you've got someone from a different faction of the Liberal Democratic Party in Japan who might be prepared to take a different approach. Won't be entirely different, but it won't be quite so brutal. Kishida is the last senior Japanese politician to actually meet with a senior North Korean I'm aware of. When we brought Kang Suk-ju to Berlin in 2014, Kishida, who was then foreign minister, happened to be stopping in the same hotel as we were at the same time. And the following morning, the North Koreans looked as if they'd had no sleep. Kishida disappeared, and there was an announcement there'd been some progress on the abductee issue. But so Kishida might be in a different situation. The difficulty will be getting people back together. I can't underestimate how brutal, from a North Korean perspective, Hanoi was. They went. The 2017 New Year's address by Kim Jong Un was the what everybody remembers for saying nice things about the Winter Olympics, which meant that suddenly there was a joint North-South Korean hockey team, and his sister went with the head of state and Mike Pence was sat grumpily behind them, and the rest. That was seen as the opening and the breakthrough. But in that New Year's address, he talked about going into mass production of nuclear weapons, about and similar bellicose things, which nobody remembers at all. The 2018 New Year's address talked about decommissioning the elements of the armed forces, about turning sort of tanks into tractors, and a whole series of other things like that got completely overlooked. Kim came to the table in Hanoi prepared to give up the whole of the Yongbyon nuclear site. Now, that's not all they had. I'm absolutely not arguing that, but it was a very big first step, and there was no way you're going to get anywhere without doing this step by step. I mean, the North Koreans are not going to go from being a nuclear state to giving them all up overnight. This is going to be a 10-year program, which is why you're back with the JPCOA, because it's going to be at least 2 presidencies in the United States, if not 3. So you've got that problem which needs to be taken up. You also have to say that the Yongbyon issue was also around inspections, because if it was Yongbyon only, it was possible for the United States to come in and inspect very simply that site to check that they were fulfilling what they promised to fulfill. The North Koreans have very long memories. Back in the late 1940s, there was the Pauli Commission that went into North Korea, an American-led commission, to actually check whether the Russians were repatriating North Korean, or Korean at the time, industrial equipment back to the then Soviet Union. And the Pauli Commission came back to Seoul and said, no, the Russians weren't they weren't taking reparations. They weren't taking this industrial equipment back. Fine. When the Korean War started, they used the results of the Pauli Commission for targeting. The North Korean, I suspect probably almost nobody in this audience has ever heard of the Pauli Commission. The North Koreans have, and the consequences. So you need to be aware of that. Last thing I'll say is to talk a little bit about the end of war declaration, because it's been a reasonably hot issue. Firstly, it's not going to go anywhere. I mean, if it was going to go anywhere, it might have gone somewhere 2 months ago, but now it's too late. We're literally weeks away from the South Korean presidential elections. The North Korean reaction, and I'm talking about the people I talked to, ambassadors, was that the South Koreans were being rather optimistic. You've just increased your military budget by the largest amount ever, and you want to sign an end of war declaration? I mean, yeah. I mean, from Moon Jae-in's point of view, I mean, it seemed by the North Koreans as self-serving. Firstly, it was a legacy issue for him. Fine, we all look for legacies in our political lives. Secondly, possibly a good thing, but it was to lock in the next president, because at the moment it's looking tighter now. But at the moment, I think the Conservatives are ahead in the South Korean presidential elections, and it's difficult to imagine any even conservative South Korean president sort of rejecting the previous end of war declaration. That would send pretty grim signals. And thirdly, it was an issue between Washington and Seoul. because, of course, it's the issue of operational control. South Korea, understandably, is very keen to get operational control of military forces back in wartime. Well, get it for the first time since 1950. It wants that back. Any end of war declaration would not have removed UN command, but it kind of would have weakened their authority a little, and it would have made it more difficult for the American administration to actually resist that change. I think actually I'll stop at that point. I had a little bit more to talk about, but that may come up in the questions.
Oh, thank you so much, Glyn. Thank you so much. It's so unique to get this, a European perspective, but also your long history with North Korea. You can see in a much deeper, more nuanced kind of a way what's happening there. We have asked the audience to submit questions, and there are some interesting questions, and some of it I think ties
I'm a bit
to.
nervous about that. Last time someone asked me an interesting question was that an audience with a large number of people from Kashmir saying, "Why did you invite Salman Rushdie to the European Parliament?"
But we won't mention that. But Hawaii has some important, I think, role to play. And for one, you talked quite a lot about nuclear power, and of course, we had the Hawaii missile scare in March of 2019. So I think we're sensitive about all of these issues. That was a false alarm, totally. But many of the audience will remember that day very clearly because we didn't know that at the time. But some of these questions really tie to, is there a more peaceful way to sort of convert that nuclear capacity into a different economic benefit for North Korea? So, for example, there's a question: is North Korea could the North Korea be allowed to convert their nuclear program into more of an electric power supply for South Korea and China? Is that something so that they would get rid of the weapons portion of nuclear?
That's absolutely something the North Koreans want to do. I mean, they want a civil nuclear program. Now, they want and they're very keen on having a civil nuclear program that's self-contained because they don't trust the outside world. One of the reasons that they didn't want to give up, at least for the moment, more than Yongbyon, is they do have at least one and possibly two uranium enrichment plants. Now, uranium enrichment plants can be a bad thing. They can be used to produce nuclear weapons, but they can also be used to produce the fuel for light water reactors. And this is the whole thing about the Iran deal. It's up to 20% is fine, above 20% is bad. So you would want inspectors in and the rest. But it then depends on if you want Washington agreeing they can have a civil nuclear program. For the moment, they've got their own energy problems. They do sell some coal to China because they're so desperate for what they get in return. But from a North Korean perspective, it's actually allowing people outside of Pyongyang to have electricity for most of the day, if not all of the day. But yes, it's absolutely something. But that requires an approach from the United States that talks about we will find ways of helping you do this. I mean, certainly there's some interest in France in that. And why are the French interested in helping the North Koreans on their civil nuclear program? Because the French have a very big civil nuclear program of their own. And they're absolutely petrified there will be a nuclear accident in North Korea. Because if you have a second Fukushima in North Korea, the rest of the world's nuclear energy program can close down.
That's a very good point.
So there are very good reasons for actually having this kind of engagement.
Well, another flip on this question is whether it's likely for North Korea to start selling their nuclear weapons to others. What would that pose?
I don't know whether I said it. In terms of their missile tests, there is good reason to believe it's perfectly possible that the North Koreans would sell at least their short and medium range missiles to other countries. They have in the past. And certainly there have been representatives of some of the world's less savory regimes watching their missile launches in the past. They've sold to a number of countries. The Pakistani independent missile program has missiles that are very similar to the North Koreans that went earlier. The North Koreans sold the Hwasong 5, I think, to Iran, which was used in the War of the Cities against Iraq. So they've certainly sold missiles. I think they're much less likely, not because they're good people, but because they're not stupid, to sell their nuclear weapons, because that would be instant destruction. You would be able to tell where that came, where its origins were. And the idea that anyone is going to allow the North Koreans to get away with that is improbable. So on the probability of selling their nuclear weapons, I'd say is extremely low. Probability of them selling quite sophisticated missile technology is probably quite high.
Frightening. That's frightening. But, well, you may have heard that Secretary of State Anthony Blinken was just here in Honolulu. He was negotiating with foreign ministers from Japan and Korea, South Korea, to develop some sort of, part of their agenda was a united front against North Korea. Also, I'm sure they talked about China as well. For the US, these are two big concerns. And so one of the questions does deal with whether North Korea would be persuaded by China, People's Republic of China, into some sort of partnership that would ease tensions between the two of them, but pose a threat to Korea, Japan, US interests.
Well, I mean, actually, I think it's last year you saw the automatic renewal of the Treaty of Friendship and Cooperation between China and North Korea. It comes up every 20 years for renewal, and it requires 6 months' notice to be abandoned. And I was surprised that it went through with barely anybody noticing. There were no celebrations in Pyongyang or Beijing, but there was almost no comment. So they've renewed that relationship. Yes, I mean, if things get very tense between Washington and Beijing, certainly the question was asked, does this mean if there was conflict between Washington and Beijing over Taiwan, for example, would the North Koreans, under the treaty, be forced to intervene?
Correct. So what is your thought about
So, but equally, if you can't have a solution.
Sort of how another way to ask the question is, how vulnerable is North Korea to be persuaded to act as a destabilizer in the region on China's behalf?
Oh, I mean, yeah, I think it. Let's be clear. That Beijing does not run Pyongyang. Mm-hmm. They clearly have a relationship, but the old idea that if Beijing said to Pyongyang, jump, the question was how high, was never true. Throughout the period from 2011, when Kim Jong Un came to power, to 2017, relations between Pyongyang and Beijing were grim. They had a very bad relationship. We didn't do anything official, but we tended to meet people in Beijing before we went to Pyongyang. And the message was always the same, because back in 2011, they were both, Xi and Kim Jong Un were both new leaders at the same time. The argument was, why don't I tell them the two new leaders should get together? It never happened. That was because relations were very hostile. There was some interest in North Korea in actually doing a Nixon, actually switching the relationship to the United States. I mean, because North Korea was very clever in actually managing a hostile relationship between Beijing and Moscow over a period of 20, 30 years. And there was an interest in kind of recreating that balance with Washington. Now, I don't think it ever got very far in Washington, but certainly it was very clear when suddenly in 2017, Kim Jong-un met Xi, that was off the table. They got the message it wasn't going to happen. So there was this sudden rapprochement with Xi, and then the summits with Moon, more summits with Xi, and if you want the Trump summits. So
you could imagine geographically, North Korea is just surrounded by hostility. If you think about Russia, China,
yeah, I mean,
that really does impact their outlook too. Well, another stream of questions really had to do with kind of international trade and what is there, and what, one part of it is how is North Korea approaching strategies for sanction evasion, and or where do major imports come from for the North Korean economy?
Well, I mean, firstly, let's say anyone who had any belief in sanctions must abandon that now. The North Koreans have imposed on themselves the most arduous sanctions one can possibly imagine by closing off their economy for nearly 2 years.
Oh yeah, that's true.
So what on earth are you going to do to them? It's going to, I mean, this idea, one more squeeze and they'll come running to the negotiating table approach. It seems to me, if anyone believes that, I mean,
yeah,
they're in fantasy land. I always have visions of Kim Jong-un sat around a table and someone saying, well, if we don't go talking to the table, then they're going to sanction the cartoon industry. Oh, well, fine, in that case. So, yeah. Do they evade sanctions? Yeah, they use every way possible. They don't accept the sanctions. They see the sanctions as illegitimate. I mean, I don't remember a single country that ever accepted the sanctions. The South Africans did not say, oh, the UN has sanctioned us, so we'll give up apartheid. They got round sanctions. Syria, Iran, for someone
many
not
cases
to evade
where it
sanctions.
has not worked very well. Well, I think another set of questions really has to do with, the people of North Korea and their perspectives. And if you could turn to more of that human side, do the people in North Korea really know about the in the democratic world? Do they know about the privileges, the freedom, the resources that people enjoy? Do they and how do they see that?
I mean, they're not ignorant. I mean, certainly the people we deal with, obviously, they tend to be the people who actually travelled abroad. But North Koreans get these days amongst young people, I'm told, if you don't know the latest South Korean pop songs, you struggle with getting a girlfriend. There's some fashion there, fashionable haircuts, clothes. There are even moves into cosmetic surgery. Their holiday. I mean, there's a new middle class in North Korea. I mean, there are package holidays to Mount Kumgang. The new ski resort is only in Pyongyang. There's fun fairs, there's water parks, dolphinariums, all available. So yes, I mean, the only reason the ski resort is halfway between Pyongyang and Wonsan is you can't get it to snow in Pyongyang. So, but that's aimed for the same set of people. There's quite a lot. I'm told there's quite a lot of South Korean dramas that are available on UBS sticks and the rest. So they have a reasonably good idea of what's going on, but equally, they are aware when they're watching, if you want, a South Korean soap, that not everybody lives like that. If I watch an American soap, I don't think all Americans are like that. So yes.
Well, I
think the urban people are certainly well aware. I'm not so sure it's true in the rural areas, because the rural areas are much more cut off and the rest.
Do you have wrapping up? Do you have any special thing to say towards Hawaii's involvement in some of this? Is there a role that Hawaii can play?
Well, I would certainly see a potential role for Hawaii. They've just got to seize it. I mean, for a long time, as you know, I was a regular attender at the Northeast Asia Economic Forum that was set up by Dr. Lee J. Cho, who tragically died.
Yes, thank you for bringing that up.
One month I was talking from Brussels at 4:00 in the morning to the Northeast Asia Economic Forum session, and tragically the next month it was to attend an online funeral. But I mean, he was a pioneer, but I mean that needs to be picked up and carried on, because he had a set of contacts that needed to be exploited.
We're doing our best to do that.
Yeah, not only, I mean, in Japan,
right.
Former Foreign Minister Taro Nakayama came to some of our events. In fact, the last one in Honolulu, I remember Taro Nakayama being there, the former Foreign Minister. Certainly in South Korea, in China,
Yes.
certainly in parts of Russia, because Northeast Asia Economic Forum was really about the Russian Far East.
Vladivostok.
And back in 1992, the Northeast Asia Economic Forum took an enormous group of something like 300 people to Pyongyang and up to Rason, which was just opening as a special economic zone. And I organized, when was it, about 5 or 6 years ago, a trip for a part of the Northeast Asia Economic Forum into Rason, where I went in with Lee J, and we talked to the North Koreans. So, I mean, I think there are projects that can be done. I mean,
thank you.
I think this is going to be something that's going to be approached a bit like the Helsinki process. There are going to be boxes. They're going to be, and the problem with the US is the US only wants to talk about its box, which is denuclearization. The North Koreans only want to talk about their box, which is about end of hostile policy and resources to get our economy going. So you need to insist that both sides, both Pyongyang and Washington, talk about them in separate boxes, but at the same time, because that's how you're going to make some progress. And it may be something that the Northeast Asia Economic Forum or Hawaii can do for that.
Thank you so much. Well, that's such an inspiring note to end upon. And thank you so much for being with us today. We so appreciate it. Glyn Ford.
Thank you.
Mahalo.